Hello chess fans, this is International Master Vitaly Neimer from PowerfulChess.com. Today, I would like to show you one of my best games which illustrates the power of rook lifts. This game, I was playing white against a strong national master Aaron Grabinsky in 2016. Now, my first move was quite unusual. Just because I felt a bit adventurous. My first move, I played knight to c3. Now this variation is mainly called the Van Giet or Dunst opening. There are also other names: the Richten opening, the Baltic opening, the Sleipnir opening, the Romanian opening, the Queen's Knight attack, the Queen's Knight opening. So, lots of names. Well, here black can reply with many moves. Basically, any move with the pawn into the center would be good. For example, on e5, now white has to play e4. Otherwise, black would play pawn to d5 and controlling the whole center. So after e4, black can play knight f6, transporting to the Vienna game. On the other hand, black can also play c5, and again white has to play e4, transposing to the closed Sicilian. Now another ambitious move for black would be d5, and here if white would try to play e4, I think black can just play pawn to d4, attacking the knight. The knight has to go back, and now after e5, it seems that black is doing wonderfully well. So, in case of d5, white should probably play just d4. And this is probably an equal position. However, in the game, Aaron played pawn to e6. Well, I guess the idea would be to transpose for him for something more similar. So I played e4. Pawn to d5, and I played pawn to d4. Yes, and we just transposed to the French defense. Bishop b4, e5, and now black played pawn to b6. Now this is a sideline. The main line is actually pawn to c5. The idea of pawn to c5 is that black is trying to break the pawn chain of white. So black played pawn to b6, and now I played, in my opinion, the most ambitious move, which is queen to g4, attacking the g7 weakness. If black would play pawn to g6, that's probably not such a good idea, as bishop g5 and gets lots of weaknesses. Obviously black would not be so thrilled about king to f8, losing his castle. So actually black was quite forced to play bishop back to f8. Now I just continue with my development. Knight to f3, knight to e7, bishop e2, bishop a6, castle, and knight to f5. So now let's stop here for a moment and look at this position, because when I was making this video I almost called it the power of punishment and anti-principle play, because white has developed 4 pieces and he castled and he controls more space, while black developed only 2 pieces and obviously is much behind in development. So how did it happen? Well, just simply because black has wasted time on moves such as b6. The bishop went to b4, but then he went back, And then the knight came here to f5 using 2 moves. Whereas I developed both of my knights in 2 moves. Now, luckily for black, this position is quite closed, as we can see from the pawn structure. So it gives time for black to allow himself to develop his pieces more slowly. While white has to figure out a way how to break through. So let's see what happened in the game. I played rook to d1, just in case, preventing ideas such as c5, because then I can take, and some things might happen on the d file, the knight might be hanging. Black played bishop to e7. And now I had to come up with a plan. Well, as I usually tell my students, one of my rules, ask yourself, well, what are the best pieces of my opponent? And as I could see here, those were this knight who got developed, and this bishop on a6. So I made up a plan how to exchange them. I exchanged my bishop and played knight to e2, with the idea to come with a knight to g3, exchanging this knight while making the g7 pawn weaker, because the knight won't be able to defend it anymore. Well, black played pawn to c6. Now I played a4, gaining more space on the queen side and scaring black in case he was dreaming of a long castle. Maybe he wanted to play b5, queen c7 and long castle. So after a4, black played pawn to g6. And now the idea of knight to g3, knight taking f5 did not seem so good to me anymore, because this pawn will take, maybe even opening the g file for black to attack. So instead I realized that black has many weaknesses on the black square after this move, pawn to g6. And who is defending those black squares? Yeah, it is going to be the bishop. So I decided to exchange him. And I played bishop to g5. Bishop took on g5, knight takes g5, and rook c8. So here I was quite confused because I could not figure out what was black's plan. Is he gonna... I mean, he cannot castle long anymore. Castling short looked very dangerous to me with all those weaknesses. So I wasn't sure what was black's idea. Now here I didn't want to play a5 because, as I said, black wants to close the position with b5 because his king is on the center. So black definitely does not want to open up the position. So I asked myself again, what is my worst piece? And it looks like my rooks, although positioned well on the queen side, they are not really doing anything. There are no open files yet. So I figured out, I was searching for a weakness and I found one. The h7 pawn. I needed to attack it one more time. And here I used my first rook lift. Rook to a3. Black played knight to b4. I played rook to h3, thinking that black now has to move this pawn somewhere, weakening the g6 pawn. So maybe if black plays h6, at some point I might even take on e6. If pawn takes, I might even take everything. But even here, after h6, I don't have to move my knight because of this pin. But surprisingly for me, black decided to take on c2, which very much looked to me like a pawn pawn, and that the knight has entered into the lines then. Okay, well, I took on h7 of the knight, and now black played king to d7, just very simply. He is connecting to the rooks and the queen, and maybe the king is escaping to c7 and even to the queen side. So I cannot give too much time for black to organize his pieces. So I played queen to f4. The idea is now I want to play g4, and once the knight is moving backwards, the f7 pawn is hanging. So black played queen to e7, and here I played g4 immediately, which was a slight inaccuracy. Here it was better for me to play pawn to a5, and if king to c7, then g4. And now taking on b6, rook c1, knight b4, and the rook goes to a3, unleashing the power of the rooks. So in the game, I thought that after g4, the black knight has to go to g7, which it will be stuck because it seems like it doesn't have any good moves. And now I played the rook to c1. Now here, a simple rook left again would be actually better, leaving the knight on c2. I played rook c1 because I felt like at some point this knight might attack and annoy the d4 pawn. So black played knight to b4, and now I used rook to c3. Well, to me, white looked wonderful. But my opponent found a genius idea, and he played knight to h5, sacrificing the knight. But this is actually blocking my rook from defending my knight. So this move actually gave Aaron lots of survival chances. So I had to take with the pawn. Rook takes h7, h takes g6, and now rook to g7. Suddenly, maybe black is the one who is gonna be dreaming of an attack on my king. So I could not let this happen, and I played rook c to g3. Pawn takes on g6, queen g6. Simply wanted to take the pawn. Rook c to g8, knight to f4, and queen to f7. Now here, surprisingly for me, the computer evaluates this position as a dead draw, 0-0-0. But in my opinion, for humans, white is slightly better, as he has the more dominating pieces. Everybody is much more active, while those pieces are more defending. I played rook to f3, threatening some jumps with the knight. Queen to f5. Now obviously I cannot take here because of a check, an intermediate move. So I played knight to d3, not allowing the queen to check. Queen to e4, rook to f4, queen to e2, knight takes b4, queen e1 check, king to g2, and queen takes b4. And now I played a good move, rook h to f3. As we know, the rooks are the best attackers when forming a battery of two rooks. Now this is also a battery, but not such a powerful one. Now in addition, white wants to invade into the powerful 7th rank, which will cripple black for good. So black had to play to retreat with queen to e7, and I immediately played rook to f6, taking more space, blocking the queen. Black played pawn to g5. Now I played queen to h5, pawn to g4, or rook to f4. Now the threat is simple. Rook going to f7. If the rook takes, my second rook takes, and I win the queen. So black had to do something. Rook to g5, queen to h6, and rook to g7. So I just repeated some moves. And now I played an excellent move. Pawn to b4. This is in order to prevent black from playing c5 in the future and creating a passed pawn. Now if black takes the pawn, this is obviously lost because of rook to f7. So instead black played a5, and I just took on a5, pawn takes, queen to h5 again, and we repeated another time. Now the idea here is that we were both in time pressure, so it was important for me to gain any spare minute available, and therefore I repeated moves. And here I played king to f1, a very interesting move, which actually puts black in a zugzwang. Now a zugzwang, by definition, is a situation in which the obligation to make a move in one's turn is a serious, often a decisive disadvantage. So which means, in other words, that black, every move of black is gonna make his position much worse. So let's see what are his options. Obviously, moving the pawn is just losing it. Now, moving the rook to g5, we lose the queen. Moving the other rook somewhere on the 8th rank, then white has a strong move, rook to takes e6, and if the queen takes, then queen takes g7. Now if the king moves, black loses this e6 pawn, and if the queen moves, then rook f7 check again. So the only possible way black could play without completely losing is c5, which happened in the game. Pawn takes c5. Again, the queen cannot take because e6 and f7 are hanging. So he played rook to h7, c6 check, king to c7. The king cannot obviously take here because rook takes e6. Now I took again. Rook takes h6, rook e7 check, king c6, and now rook f6 check. I exchanged the rooks in order to create a dangerous pass pawn. And now Aaron chose the correct defense. He played rook to g5. A very good move. As we know in the endgame, it is better to place the rook behind the pawn rather than in front. Because if the rook would be standing here after f7, the rook does not have a lot of space to move. However, after the rook went to g5, if he's gonna be placed on f5, he's gonna be looking at many more moves and directions. So I played rook g7, which was a slight inaccuracy. A better move would be rook to a7, and again could continue rook to f5, rook takes f5, king to b6, rook b5, king to c6, rook b4, rook takes pawn, and the rook takes g4 with probably a winning endgame. So instead I played rook to g7, Aaron played rook to f5, played f7, king c5, king e2, rook f4, king e3. I was trying to bring my king, however black is blocking me with a check. I had to go back. So now it is hard to advance for white, and therefore I had to take on g4. Obviously black cannot take on g4 because I just promote, so black has to take on f7. And now it is getting harder and harder to win for white, because it's one pawn advantage, but in the rook endgame it is sometimes not so easy. So I played h4, d4, h5, king c4. Now already threatening pawn to d3 check. If the king moves somewhere, this pawn might be hanging. So I had to go back and defend, rook to g3. And this was the critical position where black made the mistake. Black played a rook to b7. The idea was correct, to bring the rook and check my king. However, as we will see in the game, this was a critical mistake. The correct move was actually to check on e7 first. Now if the white king is trying to advance, actually after d3 the white is losing, because he cannot stop the pawn. The king is cut. Now if white would go to d2, now it is time to bring the rook to b7. In case of h6, black has a check. If the king moves back, just check again. And if the king goes to c1, take the pawn, bring the rook, now has to go behind it, and this endgame is supposed to be a draw. King to b4. Now white's king is running, but black also has a pawn, and in this case black can just sacrifice his pawn, and his king is close enough to create a queen next move. So in this position it was a time pressure, and black did play this move rook to b7 immediately, which allowed me to play h6, rook to b2. Now only help my king to put him on f3 forward. Rook to b3 check, king to e4, and the king got unleashed in the endgame. Now if the rook takes the rook, pawn takes, it looks like black and white are promoting at the same time. However, here white has a strong move, king to e3, forcing black to play king to c3 while playing h7, d2, and promoting with a check, which is winning. So here black had to bring his rook back, but this is already bad, because now after h7, rook to e8 check, king to f5. So the king was on e2, and black, using his checks, brought my king to f5, which is pretty good. Now black tried to counterplay with d3, but this was already too late, because now came the final rook lift. Rook to g8, cutting the rook from defending h8. d2, and I just promoted the queen. d1 queen, check, king goes, rook takes e8, and unfortunately for black, queen to d7 does not work because of rook to e6. The game ended after queen f7 check, queen f6, queen h7 check, and king to g5. There are no more checks left, and black resign. Well, so what have you learned from this game? Number 1, follow the opening principles, and if your opponent does not, punish him. Number 2, use the power of the rook lift to bring it quickly into the game. Number 3, when in time pressure, it is a good idea to repeat moves to gain a few extra minutes due to the time increment. Number 4, use the power of the zugzwang to force your opponent into making a bad move. And lastly, number 5, in the endgame, bring your king forward to help your passed pawns to advance, and finally promote into a queen. Thank you very much for joining me today. This was International Master Vitaly Neimer. For more videos, please visit powerfulchess.com.